Hey, special educators, I'm Jennifer from Positively Learning. Welcome to the Special Educators Resource Room. If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to save time and streamline your work. That's why this podcast was created, to give you the systems and solutions you need to get your time back. Tune in for tips, tricks, and tools that will help you manage your workload and make the most of your time. Whether you're brand new or experienced, all are welcome in the Special Educators Resource Room. How do you fit in exactly what your students need into your already jam-packed day? Hey, special educators, it's Jennifer from Positively Learning, and this is a series that we are continuing. How do you fit it all in? Episode 71 is full of practical ideas for fitting in social emotional learning into your already busy day. If you have time to drop everything and start a brand new curriculum, that's amazing. But this episode is for everyone else who gets to the end of the school day and thinks, what just happened? Did we accomplish anything? Ugh, that is the worst feeling. Today we're going to be talking about how to embed fine motor skill development into everyday learning. This is a topic that was fascinating to me, and I will explain why in just a moment. But a huge disclosure. I'm not an occupational therapist, and I've never been trained as one. My background is dual certification in general education, which was early childhood development, and special education. I'm also certified for birth through age 7, and I spent many years working with that age group. But my real interest in fine motor skill development came from observation of students in both the resource room setting and the general education setting. The majority of my experience is working with K through 2, and I had many students who qualified for OT, and they received OT services at school, and I think it was around 30 minutes per week, maybe less. And the occupational therapist was a contracted role from our district, which meant a OT would visit our school, provide services, usually one day a week, and provide all the services for everyone who qualified, and then they were off to another school. As a special educator, I was the caseload manager for students receiving OT services. I also worked with a large group of students who just missed qualifying for OT, and it had a lot to do with the age group. Now, again, I'm not an OT, but from my understanding, the diagnostic assessment that was used showed that my students were still within the age appropriateness. I'm not sure if it was like the 6th or the 7th birthday, but in my mind, I felt like we were just waiting for the next birthday to show that my student was struggling, and it was so frustrating. Now, I also have to say, if my students were within the age appropriateness, what were we asking them to do in the classroom? Was that developmentally appropriate? Probably not. My students were definitely showing frustration, anxiety, embarrassment, and they weren't keeping up with the pace of what we were asking them to do. So I needed to find a solution. Before I launch into all the things I tried to support students, because some things worked and some things didn't, just want to pause and check in. How are you fitting everything in? Even if students do qualify for related services, that's 30 minutes, maybe once a week. Yet the need is there 24/7. Ugh, it's just a lot. All right, now I'm going to list off some things that I tried. I'm going to just quickly start with the things that didn't have a huge impact. Then I will talk about the things that really did work. My hope is that as you're listening to this, you're not going to add all of these things, but you're going to listen and think, oh, well, that's something I could add into what I'm already doing, or that's something we already have in place. Let's just do more of that. One of the very first things I did, of course, was check in with OT. I wanted to find out what my students were working on and how that transferred over to the classroom and what I could do to support both my students and the OT working with my students. And I learned a lot. Our OT was so knowledgeable and so kind. She took the time to show me what they were working on and how that related to my students' goals and objectives. We also talked about specific prompts that I could continue using with my students. It was so helpful. After checking in, I had 2 major concerns that I shared and wanted to know more about. Number 1 was what they were working on in OT didn't seem to transfer over to the classroom, and I wanted to find out how I could support more. I also became aware that many of my students were not receiving 30 minutes of services every week, and that was because of behavior. They were so off track. They were giving the OT the biggest struggle with transitions, and they were getting maybe 10 minutes of services, tops. Once I became aware of that, I was able to find some solutions. One was I started doing some flybys, which is what I refer to as unannounced drop-ins. I would come by, my student would be under the table, and OT would be trying to coax them out, immediately put a stop to that, and I let them know that OT and I are talking. I know what's happening here, and they can do their very best when they are in OT. That helped a lot, but I still wanted to solve this big picture. So OT and I came to a couple of solutions. If you're working with students who'd benefit from more fine motor skills support, here's some ideas. I invited OT into the classroom. This was the resource room setting. I wanted her to see what I was seeing. These observations were so helpful. She was only there once a week, so the goals and objectives that she was writing on IEPs were solely based on assessment data. Now we had some observations. I also invited her to provide services inside the resource room setting. I already was pulling rotations and she could take a rotation. It was such a huge win because my students were able to remain in the classroom working with their peers. I was able to see what was happening, and OT had a huge schedule win. She was able to see all her students in the same place. Now, it was great, but it didn't last super long. I think we maybe held on for about 8 weeks before OT backed out because even though I was handling classroom management, I think it was still very overwhelming. We know how chaotic the resource room setting can be. So it didn't last long, but I still learned a lot. Our OT also started offering me consults. She was so knowledgeable and graciously took the time to answer all of my questions. She also recommended a book that I actually had already from my early childhood development. She did exercises from Brain Gym. Have you ever heard of that book? It's called Brain Gym: Simple Activities for Whole Brain Learning. And it has simple movements that you can do with students very quickly, just quick warm-ups, like making figure eights and crossing the midline. Now, I did look it up for researching this podcast episode, and it looks like Brain Gym has turned into this huge program. And I just had the book, and it had pictures of the exercises and brief explanations. I don't know if it made an impact, but it certainly was fun. We know our students could always benefit from brain breaks and more movement, so why not? I still wanted to find more ways to support my students' fine motor skill development, but I also didn't have a lot of time. So I looked around the resource room to see where I could add more of a fine motor skill component. One very simple change that I made, but it had a huge impact, was I started using font that was traceable. I used this whenever possible. So think about independent work systems. Think about any type of paper pencil activity our students are doing. Maybe this is something my students are reading and following directions, hopefully. But I'm using a legible, traceable font. So after they've done this activity, they can go back and work on letter formation. I just used this font everywhere in the resource room. So my students knew that there's any extra time, that was something they always were doing. There was no idle time, but they really enjoyed it. In fact, I would put these types of papers into sheet protectors and make these fine motor binders. I have a set of fine motor pages. Well, actually, I have tons of sets, but one in particular has 1,500 pages. You do not need 1,500 pages, but the idea is that you would print these out using assorted colors, and then you could just assemble these fine motor binders. And it was something that we stored in the resource room setting. I put a pencil pouch in that had dry erase markers and little erasers, and my students could take a binder. They could do whatever pages they want. Now, you don't put all 1,500 pages in one binder. I'm thinking maybe 50 pages. If they're double-sided, you could have 100 pages. And my students just loved them. They would take them and work on them. Then fine motor skills were erasing the pages and putting them back. Super simple, very low prep on your behalf, but high impact for our students. I also assembled the exact same style tasks with task boxes. So instead of grabbing a binder and a dry erase marker, my students could just grab task boxes. Now you could separate them by skill, like all connect the dots and all tracing lines and all cutting skills. Or you could mix and match. It really depends on your students' accessibility and their independence level, and the types of tools that you're going to use. If you are inserting tools inside the task box, you want to separate the skills. If you have in your resource room a setup where you can handle having the supplies out that your students could self-select, then that would be great too. Some years we could, some years we could not. This really worked for us, and it wasn't something that we had to add. We already had our independent work systems. Now I just wanted to incorporate more of a fine motor focus. We weren't adding anything to our school day like a brand new arts and crafts time, but instead embed it into what is already happening and where our students need support. One quick note, when you're thinking about setting up some fine motor practice, don't forget math. I always think of letter formation, and we know that's really important, but what about number formation? I have a number of the day packet, and it's an old packet where students are getting exposed to all the different ways to represent numbers. But what I did is I updated it and I added some traceable font where my students could just practice not only writing the numbers, but writing simple number sentences. I remember once when the gen ed teacher and I were thinking that our students were struggling composing number sentences. And then when we looked closer, we realized, no, it wasn't the math that was a struggle. It was the pacing, keeping up with writing the number sentence. We simply needed more practice where we could provide quick feedback and our students were ready to go. So don't forget the math. A couple of other things that we tried that had some mixed results. I remember one year I took all of our pencils and replaced them with golf pencils. I guess they worked just fine, but later when we ran out of them and returned to our tried and true pencils, I really didn't notice much of a change. With the young students I supported, I just found that novelty usually wins. Whether it's gel pens, sparkly pens, a pencil in your student's favorite color, anything that makes it a little bit more enticing to pick up and try to use. I noticed the same thing with sensory fine motor tools. I had tweezers and colorful little gadgets my students could use to pick up pom-poms and explore sensory bins. And I found that they loved them. They loved the novelty. They tried them out and they quickly ditched them and used their favorite fine motor tool, which was their fingers. So do not feel like you need to go out there and purchase all new materials. It's more about looking at what you already have in your classroom and where you can add fine motor. My favorite recommendation is providing those independent work systems so your students can have some hands-on practice and switching out to traceable fonts. That way your students will always have the opportunity to continue developing those skills and you will have the opportunity to provide that positive feedback. I hope that this long story time episode was interesting and helpful. We're all in this together and that you get a chance to try out some of these fine motor skill development tips with your students. All right, thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next time in the Special Educators Resource Room. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm dying to ask, what'd you think? Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe buttons so that you never miss an episode. You can find the show notes and links for everything mentioned in this episode at positivelylearningblog.com. See you next week for more special education solutions.